Hello everyone, this is Yash Nama. Thank you for joining me on this video. Today we will take a look at three different types of activity cost drivers. To start with, let us first understand what do we mean by activity cost drivers. Activity cost drivers are factors that are most influential in causing or driving activity costs. For example, if we talk about shipping costs, depending upon the circumstances, we can think of several factors which cause the shipping costs to increase. For instance, speed. Faster shipping will involve more cost. Slower shipping might involve less cost. Example of faster shipping could be air freight. Example of slower shipping could be via ship. Another cost driver we can think about when we talk about shipping costs is distance. Longer the distance, higher shipping cost. Shorter the distance, lower shipping cost. Another cost driver that we can think about for shipping costs is the parcel weight. Heavier parcels would involve higher cost. Lighter parcels would involve lower cost. Another cost driver could be parcel volume. Larger parcels might involve higher shipping costs and smaller parcels might involve lower shipping costs. So I hope you understood what do we mean by activity cost drivers. We can broadly classify activity cost drivers into three types: transaction drivers, duration drivers, and intensity drivers. Let's take a look at each of these one by one. We'll start with transaction cost drivers. What are transaction cost drivers? Transaction cost drivers count how often an activity is performed. Examples of transaction cost drivers can be number of receipts, number of setups, number of deliveries made, and so on. It is important to note that transaction cost drivers do not take into account how much time each activity takes. Transaction drivers assume that all setups, for instance, take the same time and effort. They assume that all deliveries can be made in the same time and effort. And they also assume, for instance, that all receipts take the same time and effort. However, this may not be the case in many situations. So transaction cost drivers are the most simplest form of cost drivers, and they are the least accurate form of cost drivers. Now, they may be accurate for some activities when indeed all setups take the same time, when indeed all deliveries take the same time and effort, and when all receipts take the same time and effort. Transaction cost drivers can be used when all outputs make essentially the same demands on the activity. In other words, transaction drivers are useful when the cost of an activity is primarily or exclusively affected by the number of times a particular action is undertaken. If the amount of resources required to perform the activity varies considerably from output to output, then more accurate cost drivers would be necessary. For instance, let us consider customer service costs incurred by the call center of a bank. Call centers are resourced with customer service agents who receive customer calls and address customer queries. The bank would have to allocate customer service costs incurred by a call center to different products and services such as home loans, credit cards, deposits, and so on. Now, can we assume that answering all call center costs would take the same time and effort? Not really. The call center may receive a range of customer inquiries like, why is my credit card not working? Or, I have lost my card, can you please block my card? Or, can you tell me the interest rates on a housing loan? And so on. Some inquiries may take 2 minutes, some inquiries may take 5 minutes, and some others may take 10 minutes or longer. In such a situation, if we were to allocate customer service costs incurred by the call center to different products and services of a bank using a cost driver such as the number of customer calls, then the cost allocation would not be accurate. Duration-based cost drivers would be better in such circumstances, which allocate costs based on the time taken for answering customer queries rather than allocating costs based on number of queries or number of calls. This call center example introduces our second type of activity cost driver known as duration drivers. What are duration drivers? Duration drivers represent the amount of time required to perform an activity. Similar to our call center example, in a manufacturing facility, it may take 10 to 15 minutes, for instance, to set up the machine to produce a simple product, and it may take 6 to 8 hours, for instance, to set up the machine to produce more complex and high precision products. In this case, if the setup costs are allocated on the basis of number of setups instead of the time taken for setups, then the complex products would be significantly undercosted, whereas the simple products would be significantly overcosted. Hence, in order to avoid such problems, we need to resort to duration drivers such as setup hours, inspection hours, labor hours, and so on. So duration drivers are useful when the cost of an activity is primarily or exclusively affected by the length of time taken to perform the action. Finally, we have intensity drivers. Intensity drivers take into consideration the type of resource, the rate of each resource, and the duration of time each resource is required to perform a certain activity. Intensity drivers directly charge for the resources that are used each time an activity is performed. Hence, they are also known as direct charging drivers. For instance, if we consider a heart surgery being performed by a hospital, such a surgery would require specialist heart surgeons who would have a very high billing rate, and such surgeries would also need some anesthesians who would charge a different rate. You may also need a general surgeon who would charge a different rate, and some helping hands. All these resources, the heart surgeon, the general surgeon, the anesthesian, and helping hands, have different pay rates. For instance, the helping hands who help the surgeons perform the surgery will typically arrive way before the specialist doctors arrive and set up the operation theater, have all the tools in place in the correct order, and they will leave well after the specialist surgeons perform the surgery. They make sure that the patient is in proper condition, and they will do all the necessary cleanup after the surgery. So while the helping hands spend the most amount of time for a surgery when compared to a specialist surgeon, the helping hands are probably the least expensive of the skilled resources required to perform a surgery. The specialist surgeons come in for a limited time period, perform the surgery, and leave. But they are the most expensive of all the skilled resources required to perform a surgery. So here, intensity drivers take into consideration the type of resource, the rate of each resource, and the duration of time each resource is required to perform a certain activity. Another example where intensity drivers can be useful would be in the case of a patisserie. If a patisserie has to prepare an invoice for a wedding cake, it would allocate costs based on the design of the cake, the weight of the cake, the special ingredients necessary for the cake, and the time required of the specialist chef, and so on. Duration drivers, like transaction drivers, may regard that all hours are equally expensive. Hence, to overcome this problem, we need intensity drivers. Intensity drivers are the most accurate form of cost drivers, but gathering appropriate data for intensity drivers may be very time consuming and an expensive exercise. So these are the three different forms of activity cost drivers we may use for activity-based costing. Depending upon the situation, we may use one or the other. I hope this video on 3 types of activity cost drivers was useful to you. If you liked watching this video, please hit the like button, and a subscribe to this channel would be massively appreciated. Take care and see you in my next video. Goodbye.